historical fiction. And if you can't hear me or if I go blank, just let me know. But I'm sitting here looking at covers of 3 of my books. And some people ask, well, what is historical fiction? And the answer, ask, 5 different historical fiction writers and you'll get 7 different answers. But I think that basically it's fiction that takes place at least 50 years ago. So by that definition, it could be, as early as the 1980s, or 1970s, but my historical fiction generally is in the 19th century. That's when it takes place. That's the period that I'm most interested in. A little bit about my background. I started, my first novel was actually a mystery, which I think is a great way to learn how to write because you have to learn the scaffolding of putting a plot together and setting up chapter by chapter, what's going to happen next and red herrings and all of that. And I quickly segued from there into historical fiction. The 3 novels that are on the screen right now all take place in Ohio, and that's where I'm from. I'm from Cleveland, Ohio, although I now live in San Francisco. So Ohio has a very rich heritage and history, and I explored different key moments, starting with Thieving Forest, that takes place in 1806. And then the Underground River takes place on the Ohio River, which is as big as the Mississippi. It's a huge river. And that takes place right before the Civil War. And that is 1860. Well, the novel takes place in 1838. And then the American Civil War started in 1860. And my latest novel, The Physician's Daughter, takes place in 1865 to 1866. So right after that war was over. So since a lot of you are in the medical profession, I probably don't need to say a lot of things that I usually say about the research that I went through to write The Physician's Daughter and all the changes that have happened in the last 100 and 150 years in the medical profession. It was interesting to me to find out not just what things had changed, like, the way we deal with labor and birth, especially, but also what things have either not changed or are making a comeback. I recently read that there are actually leech farms in the United States, and some medical professionals are using leeches again to try to clean out the blood. So that was very interesting to me. The Physician's Daughter is about a young woman named Vida Tenney, and she wants to become a doctor. Her lifelong dream was to become a doctor like her father. And her brother, who died in the very last weeks of the Civil War, he was supposed to be the one to be a doctor, but he died. And the whole family is devastated. Her father is particularly unhinged by grief. And he decides that no, Vida cannot go to medical college, but must marry instead. So when I was envisioning this story, I envisioned a sort of Taming of the Shrew meets Grey's Anatomy. So Vida doesn't want to give up her dream. She plots and schemes for ways to get to medical college, but of course, it's very difficult for a woman at that time to do anything by herself without her family's help. She enlists the support of a war veteran named Jacob Culhane. He's got his own demons that he's wrestling with because he was in the war. He was in an infamous prison camp called Andersonville Prison Camp in the last year of the war, which had no tents, no living quarters for the prisoners, barely any food, racked with illnesses, and it was run by a sort of mob rule. So he is damaged. He has PTSD. But they come together and they try to help each other. And my challenge, or my question, I guess, was, are they going to be able to find a partnership together, and what will that look like? Or are they going to be at odds with each other for the whole story? So you'll have to read the novel to find that out.
Sorry, let me interject. The scenario that you pictured, that her father said that you cannot enter into medicine and this is something that is not for women. I think this is the reality for so many countries outside of Western Hemisphere. So in Pakistan right now, most of the fiction book club members are women and they belong to the field of medicine. That is true, but generally that is in the context of being a trophy bride. Do you have the concept of trophy bride? That your wife is a doctor. She's not practicing. She's just stay-home mother. And just women have a ornamental value. So what do you have to say about that? Because your novel is very much closer to our heart over here, because this is the reality which you are picturing the scenario in 1865 and 1866, the physician's daughter. But the time has stuck in Pakistan, because I have only the knowledge of Pakistan, at least. So this is the reality today. So what do you have to say about that?
I had no idea. That's very interesting. So some women become doctors just so they can elevate the status of their husband and their marriage.
Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. And this is not throughout Pakistan, but this is the general culture. And of course, there are good news. Definitely, women, they are breaking boundaries, and they are, they are touching new milestones. My own wife is a PhD, and she is also a faculty member at a liberal arts university. So there are exceptions over there, but the rule is, and part of the reason could be poverty, socioeconomic conditions, So I would like to know your views on this, that how your novel is much more relevant to the developing part of the world.
Yeah, I mean, that's fascinating. Well, one of the things that I learned in my research with the women that I was studying, which was American women in this period, was that almost all of the women who became doctors, and I'm talking about real women, right? Not fiction. Almost all of the women had a father who was helping them. Their father was on their side. Occasionally it would be a husband, but usually it was a father. And I think if you did not have the support at that time in that culture of a man who could help you, who could help open doors, it was very, very difficult. And you have to really want it. You have to really, really want it. And I feel like for so many things, and there's no judgment. I mean, there are many things that I might try to do, but if it's too hard, I probably won't do it. There are very few things that a person has a huge drive to do. So you would really need to have that if you don't have some sort of male sponsor in America in the 1860s.
Yes, absolutely. I started reading your novel, and the things that were mentioned over here, when her father says, in the very first scene, her father says something about the person who was dying of something else. And the daughter says, the protagonist, Vita, right? So she says, how does he know? So that was, that was a very interesting point. the question that she has in her mind. So the curiosity, one thing is drive, that, okay, you want to be a doctor, that's fine. But there is another thing, curiosity. Some people are full of motivation, but not the curiosity. So your character shows curiosity in the very first sentence, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So my question related to your daughter's, physician's daughter is, if you really have the drive and curiosity to become a doctor, right? To go into the medicine. So in that situation, although women will be less in number, but the quality will be highest.
Mm-hmm.
On the second hand, if you just perform some sort of affirmative action and then have some quotas for women without actual drive or curiosity, you just have quotas for women. So wouldn't it reduce the quality of doctors?
If you just have
But
quotas, yes. And it's not, you're saying if it's not being driven by your own personal drive. Absolutely. I think absolutely. And it's interesting because I don't know if this was the case in your country, but in our country, for a while, they tried to give women a separate education, though those women who wanted to become doctors, they did not want them in the same classroom as the men. So they began just making different colleges. There was one in Boston, there was one in Philadelphia. They were all called something like Medical College for Women, the Boston Medical College for Women. And the education was inferior. They could not attract the same quality of teachers as, say, Harvard or another prestigious school. So the women, although they had the drive, they did not get the level of education in these places that they could have gotten, and they did get once the more established colleges opened their doors to women. And in fact, I have a little story about this, if you don't mind, as I was doing my research. So the novel takes place, part of the novel takes place in Cleveland, Ohio, and I'm from Cleveland, so it was very exciting for me. I was very excited to write about it. I don't know if you know the name Elizabeth Blackwell, but she was the first woman to get a medical degree in the United States. And this was in 1849. And she actually was let into her college, a co-ed college, men and women, as a joke. Nobody thought she would come. It was a hilarious joke. They voted her that she could come in, and to everybody's surprise, she went. And she did very well. The hardest thing that she faced was actually finding a room to rent, because none of the boarding houses or rooming houses wanted to rent a room to a woman who was trying to become a doctor, because clearly, she was not a reputable woman. So that was her biggest challenge, finding a place to live. Anyway, she had a sister named Emily, who also became a doctor. And Emily went to the Cleveland Medical College in 1850. So I was very excited. Yay, I found a place in Cleveland that took women, and I'm going to set part of my novel there. And I started reading. I started doing research. I always start doing research for my next novel when I'm still working on my previous novel, doing edits and so forth. I start doing research for the next. So I had been doing research for almost a year when I went to Cleveland to visit my family and to do some more hands-on research. And I went to this place called the Dittrich Museum of Medical History, and the people there were very nice. And when I told them my project, they said, "Oh, no, you can't have a woman come to the college here because they did not admit women into this college." And I said, "Well, Emily Blackwell, blah, 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 blah. She went there. Well, yes, she did go there, but they admitted women for 5 years and then they closed the door. They voted that no more women could attend. So maybe you could just move your time period a little bit. And I said, well, maybe, okay, maybe when did they start admitting women again? And the docent there told me 1918. So from 1856, I think, until 1918, they had a policy of not admitting women. How many years is that? Almost 70 years. I mean, it's crazy. So this was the first time I had encountered a right that was given to somebody and then taken away, right? They were allowed to go, then they weren't allowed to go. And I was very unhappy. I was very dejected. I went back to my dad's house and I was thinking, what am I going to do? Can I change it so it's World War I? But I went back to the District Museum the next day and they were very nice. They set me up in a room. They just kept bringing me books and volumes of research. And in one, there was a woman's dissertation from 1980, and there was one paragraph that said that the dean of the medical college, I'm sorry, and this whole dissertation was about these women, these early women who got their medical degree. There was one paragraph that said there were a couple of women who were admitted under the dean's discretion after the door was officially closed. And one of them was admitted because her husband was a student there. So they thought, well, he'll be able to help her. So I thought, okay, that's it. I've got my example. I can keep going. As long as there was just one woman who was admitted, even after the official policy was closed, I'm okay. I'm going to use this. This I can use, because my feeling of historical fiction is that it doesn't have to be the norm. In fact, it's better if it's not the norm, but it does have to be possible, right? So here was my piece of evidence that it was possible for my character to go to this school in 1866. Now, I see there are a few things in chat, and I'm very bad. Oh, thank you for putting those names up. I'm very bad at multitasking. So if you have questions, please raise your hand or just jump right in.
Yeah, sure. That's the normal routine in our club.
Great.
So my question related to you finding one example and then building a story on it. So how much do you try to be historically accurate? Are you rewriting history?
No, I am not rewriting history, but all of my characters are made up. They might be composites. I read a lot of memoirs. I read a lot of firsthand accounts. What I'm really interested in is the flavor of life at that time. I like to go into another world and experience it when I'm a reader. And that's what I try to do as a writer. But, of course, I'm constantly doing small, quick searches on Google, such as, what sort of street lamps were available in 1866, or how did I think there's a part in the beginning where I use different terminology for the heart, because that's what they used then. So I'm very conscious of trying to get those sorts of details correct. There's always going to be some mistakes, because there just always are. But I do try my hardest to keep all those details correct.
And I noticed it in the very first scene of Physician's Daughter. The parakeet sees the outer ear and she points out 3 parts of it, if I'm not wrong.
Yes. Uh-huh. Yeah,
So
my character loves lists. She loves memorization. She's curious. She loves math, though she recognizes that she's not that good at it. She is not very much like me, I have to say. I was not a science person. I did like math, but I could tell I could only go so far.
Okay, so being a historical fiction writer, not any other thing, and you are mainly focused on the time period from 1806 to 1866, near or around American Civil War, or that particular time period, the start of 19th century to the middle of 19th century. So my assumption is there must be some history teacher that inspired you to focus on that period, or was there some event that changed your way of thinking and you are obsessed with that particular time period? So please enlighten us.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I had so many fantastic history teachers in high school, and when I went to college, I majored in history and English. And in fact, my major was Victorian history, but it was in England. It wasn't America. But I liked that time period very much. I studied it. I wrote about it. I'm not really sure why I stuck with it so closely, but when I started writing, I think I read a lot of Victorian novels that I really liked, and that's what started me off. I love Anthony Trollope, for instance. But I wouldn't try to write about England being American. So that's why I brought it back to America. And it was fun for me to write about Ohio, because in America, you always have to take your state history when you're in 4th or 5th grade. So since I lived in Ohio, I had to take Ohio state history when I was 10 or 11. And I hated it. I thought it was so boring. And then when I was an adult, I went back to it and I just found it fascinating. It's much more multicultural. There were lots of different groups trying to live together. It's not the way it is now. It was a very different place back then. And I just found it fascinating.
Excellent. Actually, I have read some of the history of American Civil War. And to recap, there is a channel on YouTube which is called Oversimplified. Have you tried it? Oversimplified channel.
No.
So that gives an excellent overview of whatever the particular events are, and it is mainly focused on historical events. Oh. So
I'll look for it
now. Okay, sure. Alamsha, please go ahead with your question.
My very first question with you would be, when you write and when you think of your characters, or you write your characters, for example, Veera, who's an ambitious 18-year-old, and do you think of your characters first, or you think of your storyline, the time period first? What do you come up with first?
I think I think of an idea first. I have an idea. I have a friend who she and her family left Afghanistan when she was I think 8 years old, and she's lived in California for most of her life after that. But when I met her, she was very involved in Afghan women and young women education, their education. So in talking with her, I started really thinking about women and education, and thinking about how my ability to get an education was really fairly easy. There weren't too many people standing in my way. There were people supporting me. It felt hard at the time, but it was not hard. It was easy. And so from there, I started thinking about, well, what would it have been like for a woman 100 years ago when it would have been harder to get an education? And then I started thinking about the sort of women, as I said before, I started thinking about who would be the type of woman who would want to get an education. I did not, at first I had her want to be a biologist, but I just thought eventually that, medicine and doctoring is so interesting to write about and to read about. So I switched it to medicine. So it sort of started with an idea, which fed into a character, which fed into a story.
Okay. Abir is our fourth year student of pharmacy. Abir, please go ahead with your question.
Okay, so just like you mentioned a while ago that historical fiction, it needs additional research, right? Because you have to make it real. You have to connect the past with the present, right? So what was the main challenge that you faced while writing The Physician's Daughter, and how did you overcome that challenge is my question.
Well, one challenge was definitely the story I told, in which it seemed like the whole story had to be scrapped. That was a challenge, and figuring out. So Vita, I did not pretend in the novel that the Cleveland Medical College welcomed Vita with open arms. So I had to figure out how she was going to meet that challenge, right? Not just me, but she has to meet the challenge too of getting that door open. So just in terms of figuring out the story, that was sort of difficult. It was difficult, but also just, as I said, I'm a writer. I did not go to med school. So learning all of, it was just a drop in the bucket, the research that I did compared to what you all have done. And even that was very challenging. Keeping things straight. I have so many piles of, I tend to write in 4x6 note cards, and then I file them and I try to organize them. But I also have printouts from the internet, and, watching YouTube videos on how to deliver a breech birth. Everything, all of that it was interesting, but it was also very time consuming. And just for the smallest medical detail, I had to do quite a bit of research. So that was a big challenge too. And also, I think a challenge for any writer is to just keep going when it seems like, your manuscript is just a big mess and you don't know how your character is going to get what she wants in the end. And you've been writing it for so long. When I started writing this, Barack Obama was president and the UK was still part of the EU. So it's taken me a long time, and you have to, I have to have a kind of a stamina, to keep going.
Okay. Since our program is live streamed on YouTube as well, so we have a question on YouTube live stream, and I'm going to just read it out loud. Wait a second. And the question is from the user Samreen. Her question is, hi, so good to hear from you. So is this your only profession? Authors generally have some other jobs as well. Why is it? So let me rephrase it and let me add my own points. So what makes an author phenomenal? Or is the job market tilted towards the top 1% of the authors? So this is, I think, some economic aspects she wants to talk about. So please go ahead, highlight this.
Yes, it's almost impossible to make money writing fiction unless you are really the top, I would say 2% of writers will make enough money to live on. Although I think that is changing too, and there's a wider variety of the kinds of writers who can make a living. So, of course, there are the names that everybody hears about, the big mystery writers, you know, they make a living, but there are also people like Stephanie Meyer, who wrote Twilight, and she was at first self-published and got discovered. So there's a lot of different ways these days in which you can make a living, and you might be able to make a living and nobody's even heard of you because you self-publish and you found your audience, your market, and you can make a living that way. I worked for many, many years as an editor. I worked at UC Berkeley as an editor at a research unit for many years. And now I teach creative writing at Stanford University in their continuing studies program. I also have a partner, a husband who has a full-time job, and that helps. So, you know, somehow we, you know, that's the way we've made it work. And I think that most writers probably have a gig like editing and teaching in order to make ends meet.
Okay. Tanya, please go ahead with your question.
Hello. My question is, what kind of research did you do before writing, and how much do you spend in brainstorming before writing?
I'm sorry, what was the second part of the question?
How much time do you spend in brainstorming?
Oh, brainstorming. I spend a lot of time brainstorming. I brainstorm and I write in notebooks before I ever start, and I brainstorm and I write in notebooks throughout the entire process. I'm not really the kind of writer who thinks of a plot and a storyline and characters, and then I write it exactly how I thought it or imagined it. I'm really the type of writer who writes to figure out the story. So my stories always change as I write them. And sometimes that's annoying to me, but that's just my process. That's just how I do it. So that's why it takes so long. I do a lot of research to answer your first question. I do a lot of research before I even begin. I want to make sure that I have the sort of framework or the landscape. I have basic information about the culture, the food, the people, the time. I'm not a little bit about the politics, although I don't usually write about politics. So I do try to do a lot of research. And the interesting thing for me is when I do my research, often I think in the beginning that I'm going to be writing about one thing. And then as time goes on, there will be little things that I've read along the way that have just stuck with me. And I realize later, maybe months later, that actually, I want to write about a breech birth. I don't care about bloodletting, for example. So often there's a very strange detail that I come across that I just want to use, right? It's like finding a little gem and you just want to put it in your necklace. So you find a way to do that. That's how I write.
Great. And you mentioned that you write little notes and then you collect them and then you produce your pieces, right?
Yeah.
Masterpieces. So here in my university, I am going to start a session on focused pen writing. We are just going to sit there for 30 to 60 minutes without our mobiles, without internet, and we are just going to write with pen, whatever we want to write. So this is something that I was about to start, and I have already announced it, and I have the team who is going to do that. So it is so glad to hear that other people also, you know, they can they can provide the fuel to this effort. We have another student, Arish. Arish, please go ahead with your question.
Hi, my question to you is, are there any underrepresented groups or ideas featured in your book, the recent book? If so, please discuss them. And also, how has your writing changed you over the years as a person? Yes.
How has my writing changed my views as a person?
Your personality.
Yeah.
I see. Okay. Well, those are very good questions. Are there underrepresented people in my novels? There are in The Floating Theater and in Thieving Forest, for sure. And in The Physician's Daughter, I will tell you something that I don't tell anybody, which is that Vita's mentor, the doctor who, the way it worked in 1866 for somebody studying medicine is that they had to work with a mentor before a real doctor shadow them for a year or two before they even applied to medical college. So Vita is working with this doctor in Cleveland, and I always envisioned him as African-American, and he is African-American. And there were African-American doctors at that time, though it was, they were few and far between. It was harder for an African-American, or at least as hard as it was for women to go into the medical profession. But there was one doctor named Augustus, I can't remember his last name at the moment. And he was a Civil War doctor in the Civil War. And he was, I really liked his story, so I decided to use him. But I never call him out as African-American. I really went back and forth on this. And the reason I decided not to is because at this time and place in the American culture, if you're writing about race, then that sort of, you're writing about race and you're writing about gender. Race tends to go to the forefront, in terms of the ideas and what's going on in the story. And I really wanted this story to be about gender. So even though in my mind, and there are clues in the book that this doctor is African-American, I don't spell it out.
Okay, and if I'm not wrong, the doctor's name is Alexander Thomas Augusta.
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah. And it's funny that you mentioned that this race and gender has become so explosive topics that outside the Western Hemisphere, sometimes it looks so funny that you bend over backward to show that, okay, nothing is going on. Okay, we only had good intentions. So it has become so explosive. So on this, Professor Dr. Gadsar, he is a Canadian professor. His book is Parasitic Mind. I would highly recommend it. So he describes ideapathogens that overwhelm your brain, and all you can think about is about those ideas. So he mentions this obsession with race and gender to a sort of ideapathogen. So it multiplies just like Richard Dawkins' memes. So I am talking to you, so I am spreading my ideapathogen to you as well. So I am so much sensitive for right or wrong reasons. So I'm going to make you as well. And there was another book that I wasn't able to read, and its title was Tyranny of Niceness. So you have to be nice. Things don't have to conform to the reality, but you have to be nice, and nice according to my definition. So these are a few things that look funny when you look from the outside world, and the outside world can, of course, exploit your sensitivities. They can very much exploit your sensitivities because you have the resources. So that's the one of the theses of that book, Parasitic Mind by Professor Gadsar. So I would highly recommend it.
Okay. Thank you.
Alamsha, you're welcome. Alamsha, you have a question.
My question is about your other book, which is The Underground River. When I was reading it, I just started reading it recently. So I was really fascinated about this idea of the floating theater. I wanted to know, how did you come up with this idea, or what made you want to incorporate this idea in your book?
Well, and in fact, the original title of the book is The Floating Theater, and the published version in the UK and in Europe is called The Floating Theater. I knew that I wanted to write about early theater. I did a lot of theater when I was young and in high school, and I just loved that sort of community, and I wanted to write about it. And I got from the library a book that was like, it was huge. It was so thick and it was so big, and it was, American theater. And I opened it up to, about 1800, and I read the first paragraph, or maybe it was the second paragraph, where I read about a floating theater. And I thought, oh my gosh, that would be so much fun to write about. So it was like sort of a miracle. I just found it right away in this massive book. I found the one paragraph that I needed right away. And I just built the story from there.
Okay. You mentioned about your research, and you make a lot of notes, and then you get a few key points that you think can be exploited in creating your stories, right? So are there any particular books that you want every historical fiction writer to have read before attempting to write as a historical fiction writer? So apart from your 3 books, at least, and Amazon shows a lot of other books, and I was glad to find that Amazon also says that your novel, The Physician's Daughter, is a #1 bestseller in history of women in the American Civil War. So you must be very proud of it, right?
Yes, I am. That's wonderful. Yeah, I like that. Well, I think that I would not, how do I phrase this? I have books that are meaningful to me and that speak to me. I think it's different for every person. So when you're reading a book that inspires you, that's the book that you should be having on your bookshelf to help you as you write. I have certain books that I take down. I like to look at how they put a sentence together, how they bring out an emotional truth. All of these books I use because they speak to me, but it might be different for you. You might find other books. You just have to be thoughtful and aware of how you read and what moves you.
Excellent. We have another question from live stream. It says, what is the one thing about your writing that you would want your readers to appreciate even 100 years from now? Because in your novels, you capture one moment in history. So that moment is alive. So if someone sees this podcast, whatever you can call it, after 100 years, so what could be the one thing that readers at that time and listeners at that time, you want your legacy to be?
For The Physician's Daughter or for any of my novels? I mean, I think it's different for every novel.
Okay, go one by one.
Well, I think for Thieving Forest, I would say that the Midwest, the Midwestern part of the United States, is not as homogenous as we like to think it was. And that for a while, there were these very different kinds of groups, not just white and Native American, but different subgroups within all of them that were really trying hard to get along and trying to find ways to do it. And sometimes better and sometimes worse, a lot of times worse. But I would say it's a lot more diverse than we think it was, and we tend to think of Native Americans as all being sort of one one culture, and it just was not. There are many, many cultures in Native American communities. So I would think that that would be the one takeaway I would want. The diversity of life at that time, maybe not something we can learn from because they were not able to get along so well, but it did happen. It was there. The floating theater, I think, for me, the main character there, she was based on my sister, who is, as they say, on the spectrum. So she's maybe not autistic, but she has many social challenges. And she had to learn, my idea of the story is that you're watching a woman who goes from sort of seeing how slaves are being treated to feeling it. It's going from the mind to the heart. And that's a process that I find interesting. It's not that she is, she doesn't, it's not about being a good person or a bad person. It's becoming aware. It's her awakening in a way. For the physician's daughter, gosh, I guess just perseverance, I mean, it's not really about gender, it's about perseverance. And there are always going to be obstacles and blocks and people in your way, and even yourself. I mean, part of her obstacle towards the middle of the book is she's not as good as it as she thought she would be. She can do the memorization, but she's not so great with people. So sometimes the obstacle comes from yourself too, and just learning how to overcome that.
Dania, please go ahead with your question.
Okay, so my second question is, what readers want to read is your priority, or do you only focus on what you want to share with them?
Well, I want to make a good story. I want to write a good story. Story is very important to me. And I definitely think about my readers in terms of what's going to be interesting, what's going to keep them turning the pages. I'm not just writing for myself. If I was writing for myself, I would just be taking walks and thinking of my story every day, and that would be that. That would be enough. But I'm writing for other people, and I want to entertain other people. I feel like part of it is definitely entertainment. If I can put some ideas, new or old, or different twists of ideas into a reader's head, that's wonderful. But I definitely am writing to keep people interested and entertained.
Alamsha, please go ahead.
I wanted to know, if you had to play one of the characters from your own books, then what character would that be?
I don't think it would be Vita Tenney, because I think being a doctor sounds terrifying personally. So I don't think I would want to do that. I think I would want to be the character in Thieving Forest, Susanna, because she goes on this great adventure. She goes through she finds all sorts of different people, different communities, and interacts with them in different ways, and just is exposed to so much. I think I would like to be her.
Okay, so you mentioned about the protagonist of Thieving Forest, and you said that you might want to be her, right?
Mm-hmm.
So my perception was that writers like yourself who do a lot of research and then write about them, right? So you have some introvert inclinations, but you just said that you would want to be a character who is exposed to so many things. So is this a contradiction, or how do you see your personality?
Definitely a contradiction. And I'm not sure if given the chance, I would actually act on becoming Susanna in Thieving Forest, I might just want to sit in my little office at my computer and write about her rather than do all the dangerous things that she does. But yes, definitely, I am happy being, I'm not an introvert necessarily, but I like being alone. I need to be alone for a certain amount of time. And so that's probably why I'm drawn to somebody who is exactly the opposite.
Wow. I also had the similar observation. Girls who are much more extroverts, they tend to have boyfriends who are, position holders and sort of shy. And conversely, girls who are shy tend to have boyfriends, or they have their inclinations towards guy who are much more extrovert, and sort of opposite attracts as well. It is not necessary that you have, okay, in your character, in the physician's daughter, I'm not asking you to have any spoilers, but just tell us, do you mention any relationships between teenagers, boyfriend, girlfriend, these relationships? Because the novel starts with the relationship between father and his daughter. And of course, it is going to get much more complicated. So do you also focus on teenage life as a girl and boy and their sexual attractions? Do you talk about that as well in your novel?
Not so much teenagers, but there is a love interest for Vida. I mentioned earlier this man, Jacob Culhane. He started out as a sort of throwaway character, a love interest that her father pushes towards her, saying, maybe you can marry this guy. I didn't think that he was going to last the whole novel, but I really liked him and I kept writing about him. He started getting his own chapters and his own points of view. And I found him a really interesting character, and I just kept him around. And now he's almost as big a part of the book as Vida is. And so their relation, they definitely have an attraction for each other, but also their ambitions, they have different ambitions, and that pulls them apart.
Okay. And for the listeners who do not know yet, your novel, The Underground River, it was New York Times book editor's choice. And in the UK, it is entitled The Floating Theatre. And second thing is your novel, Thieving Forest. It won the North American Book Award for Best Historical Fiction. So my question is related to this. Is it a proper application that you have to file, or you just publish it and then universe, finds you? So what is the process of becoming New York Times #1 bestseller and this sort of criteria? Do you apply for it or they find you?
No, you don't apply for it. It just, you have to be a little bit lucky.
Okay. So to be lucky in this, especially in these times, and the sensitivities in the Western culture that I talked about, isn't it important to have some spice in your novel, or automatically just start a controversy so that universe can find you easily? Not in the way that universe found Salman Rushdie, not in that way, but at least spark some controversy so that it is easy for the universe to find you.
Well, I think that there are writers who can, who seek out controversy, and that's interesting to them and part of who they are and what they want to write about. I would say that I'm not really that way. I sort of think of a novel or story idea, and if there is any controversy in it, I try not to shy away from it. But I don't start by thinking, well, what can be a spark that I can throw in?
Okay, that's very good to know that you remain organic, you remain natural.
I try to.
And whatever things, excellent, excellent. That's very good to know. Okay, so do you plan to write anything in the future outside of that 19th century world, and then, you know, or would you stick to the genre of historical fiction writer in the future? So your future plans.
Yes, sure. Well, actually, I am writing a novel now. I have been writing it for about a year now, working on it for a year or more. I think I started it a week when the very week that San Francisco got locked down from COVID with the pandemic and all of that. That's when I started. That actually takes place in 1940 in Ireland. So I have gone outside my little state, outside America. I've gone outside my century, so new territory, and it's been really fun. My family's from Ireland. My father's side of the family's from Ireland. My mother's side of the family's from Ireland. I visited there many times, and I thought it would be fun to write about it.
Excellent. And if you plan to cross the continents, then you're most welcome to write about India, Pakistan, Asia. So it is also a very rich culture. And if you need any sort of help, any interviews, so we would be very glad to help you in that.
Thank you.
In your research. Yeah, in some sort of cultural nuances that you may find difficulty in finding. So we can offer our help, whatever you need.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I can see the 1 hour mark, and I truly appreciate you giving us your precious time. And one very last question that we ask our every guest: what are your book recommendations? Your 3 books. Out of those 3 books, our book club has 2 books, and I have your recent book on Kindle, The Physician's Daughter. Apart from your own books, definitely we are going to read it, right? In your honor, we always do that. Any other book recommendations?
Let's see. Do you want it to be historical fiction?
It's up to you. It's totally up to you.
Okay. There's this very good book that is unlike any book that I've ever read. I would never try to write like it because it's so odd and entertaining, and it's just not like anything else. It's called The Last Samurai, and it's by a woman named Helen. Can't remember her last name. Maybe you can Google it very quickly. It's not the movie with Tom Cruise. It's completely different from that. But it's fascinating and strange, and that is what I would recommend. The Last Samurai, that's right. Helen something. I'm not in my office, so I can't look at the book.
Yeah, Helen DeWitt.
Helen DeWitt, yes, thank you.
Helen DeWitt. Okay. Yeah, by the way, I watched the movie. Yeah. Abir, do you have a question?
Yes.
Abir, your voice is cracking. Okay, so I think she has some issues. So I have watched the movie, and definitely we are going to read this novel as well.
No, sir. I was.
Okay.
No, sir. I was saying I was telling the.
Maybe you could type your question in the chat.
Yeah. Sorry for the interruption. Martha, thank you so much. Thank you so much for all your work that you are doing and inspiring our fiction book club. And any last words that you want to share? And then I'm going to conclude this meeting.
All right. Well, thank you very much for having me. This was really fun to talk to you guys, and I loved your questions. And if you think of any questions, you can send me an email. Any more questions, you can send me an email or, look at my website and contact me through there. Thank you.
Sure. And the link to your website and the information about your books will all be available in the YouTube live stream description. So thank you, Martha. And now I'm going to end the meeting.